Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
When you look at Japanese kimono, you can essentially read them like books. They have their own lexicon, they have their own vocabulary, and they have their own language, a language of color symbolism, but also imagery. You can learn to read them.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now. The farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Hello, welcome to the Good Dirt Podcast.
Today we have something delightful for you on the Japanese art of slow living. Emma, do you want to tell them about our guest?
Sure. So today we have Natalie Leon. Natalie is an author and Japanologist from the UK. So though she is English, she has spent significant time researching Japanese language and culture and carrying these experiences home and sharing her passion for Japan through her Japan-focused Instagram account, and she pursues her interests in kimono, tea, and Japanese seasonal tradition. She also holds a master's degree in Japanese studies, specializing in Japanese art history and anthropology, which she completed following her studies in East Asian art history at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
She recently published The Japanese Art of Living Seasonally, an invitation to celebrate every day, which is a beautiful guide that unlocks the secrets of Japan's seasonal culture to help you relish the seasons wherever you are. In this book, Natalie explains and shares how seasonal living can be incorporated into our own lives. For all of you slow living through the seasons enthusiasts, this conversation is for you. Here is Natalie Leon, author of The Japanese Art of Living Seasonally, an invitation to celebrate every day.
My name is Natalie Leon. I'm a British Japanologist, which means that I have a lifelong passion and interest in Japan, which I've studied for many years. I have a master's in Japanese studies. I write about traditional Japanese culture and English for people, and I specialize in seasonality. That's my great love, my passion. I've been sharing that on social media for many years. My first book, The Japanese Art of Living Seasonally, is coming out next month. That essentially is my love letter to seasonal Japan, an invitation to everybody to join me on that journey.
What got you interested in Japanology?
Yeah, well, there's two prongs, right? There's the seasonality and there's the Japanology. I grew up in the English countryside in Hertfordshire, so the seasonality aspect has always been a part of my life. It's kind of just built in when you grow up in the countryside. But the Japanology part came later. It's a funny story, actually. When I was a child, my mum used to have this beautiful black lacquered cabinet. She kept all kinds of exciting, fancy things in there. One day, I was probably less than 10 years old, she took this huge bundle of fabric, really brightly colored fabric, or at least that's what I thought it was, out of the cabinet. And she kind of unfurled it to show it to me. And what I didn't know then was it was a kimono. And it was a very special kind of kimono called an jikake, which is a part of a bridal ensemble. It's a heavily padded hem. It's extremely heavy. It's very ornate. It has incredible embroidery, often done with kind of metallic threads. and it's exquisitely beautiful. And it's what Japanese brides wear over their bridal kimono. From the moment I saw that, I was hooked. I was completely fascinated, enchanted, entranced, and I kind of fell in love. And I was so young then, I didn't even really know or understand what I was actually looking at. I just knew that that was it, and I had to know more.
It was just really pretty.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Blew my tiny mind. I wanted to know, like, what did all the patterns on it mean? That all these birds and flowers, what did they mean? And all the different colors, what did they represent? Who would have worn this and how would they have worn it? When would they have worn it? Why would they have worn it? Because I'd just never seen anything like it before in my life. That led me to becoming more and more interested in traditional Japanese culture and art history, which is one of my specialities. And so that interest has been there since I was very small. What I didn't realize until much later was that the thread of all the things that interested me was that whether that was kimono or tea ceremony or matsuri, which is all the annual ritual festivals that take place in Japan throughout the year, the thread that kind of bound them all together was this sort of cult of the seasons, the seasonality aspect.
Oh my goodness. Where did your mother get the kimono? How did she happen to have it and hang on to it? And do you know why she chose that moment to show it to you?
My mother had it because a friend of hers in the 1970s had been sent to Japan for work. And he knew that my mother was very interested in Japan and in textiles and in vintage. He bought it back for her as a gift. So I don't know if he purchased it in a flea market in Japan or if he was given it as a gift, but he gave it to my mother as a gift. And so she kept it very carefully, very beautifully wrapped up in tissue paper in this black lacquered cabinet, which I can close my eyes and see so clearly. So that's how it came to be in a cabinet in Hertfordshire in the UK when I saw it, which must have been in the 90s.
So after she showed it to you, did it come out? Were you able to look at it frequently? Did it become sort of a part of your life then?
I mean, it definitely, when I look back now, I can see what a pivotal moment that was for me, but I didn't
Yeah.
necessarily realize it at the time because I was very young. And then I think she just wrapped it really carefully back up because my mother keeps everything very carefully. So it's probably still there. The thing is, kimono are wearable art. So you can hang them on the wall and people do, and they look exceptional. But the only thing is, if you do that and they're in direct sunlight, then they become very faded very quickly. So I think she was worried about it being faded, which is why she kept it so carefully wrapped up and tucked away, which is what Japanese people do with their kimono. They're folded flat and they're kept in specially designed cabinets, exactly like that.
I also love this idea of this textile being sort of your entry into all of this, because I don't know if you know this, but Lady Farmer, the project behind this podcast, we started as a sustainable fashion brand. I just think that textiles, the way that we engage with them now, because they've become so cheap and easy to consume and overconsume, we really forget the weight that they carry. And they're such a beautiful window and art and to culture and what we value. I love that your first sort of aha moment with Japanese culture was this beautiful kimono. It makes sense. That's so lovely. You mentioned seeing the birds and the nature on this textile. Tell us about that, sort of how that unfolded, and then ultimately to your realization that seasonal living and slow living was just as much a part of all of this as the art and the language and the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting, actually. I did know that about you guys, and I found that really interesting. So I should explain, like, in another life, before I went back to university to do my master's, I was actually a vintage dealer in London, and I did that for a decade. So I've been buying vintage and collecting vintage, including textiles like kimono, since I was a teenager. My mum was wearing 1920s and 1930s clothes in the 70s. I kind of very much inherited that from her. And so it didn't seem odd to me as a teenager growing up to be wearing 1950s clothes, 1970s clothes. This is a 1960s piece that I'm wearing today. It's actually my favorite sweater. I think that textiles are amazing because not only are they teach us so much about other cultures, especially if you're looking at something like the kimono, which has become this iconic, globally beloved and globally recognizable garment, because anywhere you go in the world, people know, well, that's a kimono that comes from Japan. That's part of Japanese culture. That's part of their national dress, etc. But also this idea of, I think, vintage as well, because I've been collecting vintage a long time, not just textiles, but other things. And so that was my way in, but it's also, I guess, buying vintage before it became, it's interesting. Like it's something I've done for such a long time that I didn't think about it. I didn't overanalyze it or kind of put it under the microscope too much. But I realize now, looking back, things become so much clearer that way, don't they? You look at your life in reverse and it makes so much sense, but lived forwards, not so much always. This was one of my core values, that I believed in buying vintage and buying secondhand because these items were so beautifully made. People were paid a living wage when they were making them. They have lasted the test of time. If we look after them, they'll last even longer. And it's, part of a circular economy. There are so many things about buying vintage, not just textiles, that just makes sense to me and always have done. Anyway, getting back to the nature aspect of what you were asking me. So when you look at Japanese kimono, you can essentially read them like books. They have their own lexicon, they have their own vocabulary, and they have their own language. And that's a language of color symbolism, but also imagery like birds, flowers, plants, etc., grasses, which are all symbolic of certain ideas, whether they're referencing a very, very ancient poem, or they're referencing a specific season, or perhaps it's the status of the wearer. They're telling you whether they're married or unmarried, how old they might be. They give an indication to the formality of the event that they're designed to be worn at, or they might tell you the wishes of a parent for a child. Children's kimono are so beautiful. They're covered in very, very brightly colored. They're very joyful, but they're also covered in auspicious symbols. They represent the parents' wishes for their child, for their happiness, for their health, for their success, etc. You can learn to read them. Like in art history, you learn to read a painting. It's very much the same thing. You can learn to read the kimono and understand what the wearer is telling you with their ensemble that they've created, what season they might be referencing, for example. If it's irises, maybe it's early summer. Iris is also very lucky. So I have a friend who's a kimono dealer, and she wears them either iris kimono or iris colored kimono anytime she feels she needs a little extra oomph. She wants to feel lucky, like she has a business meeting or an important appointment. So she kind of girds herself in those colors and those images because of what they represent for her. So it's not just established symbolism, which has been established for over 1,000 years, but also her personal experience and her personal interpretation. That's one of the reasons I love kimonos, because it's so expressive. You can do very much like the Victorians did with gemstones. Each stone represented something and they spelled out messages in the jewelry, or the language of flowers, like florography. It's very much like that. You can have hidden messages or not so hidden messages within your outfit that you're communicating to those in the know what you want to say.
Oh my goodness. I have to interject here. Before we came on, we were talking about how we think there's a lot of overlap in our spaces here. One thing you probably don't know about me is I also studied art history in graduate school. My work was with John Ruskin. He was a Victorian art critic. And he was very tuned in and fascinated with Japanese art because of its connection and elevation of nature. And he felt like this was something very unique and beautiful and important. He did a lot of sketches himself that were in the mode of, I think, Japanese drawings and so forth. And he was in the Victorian era as well. So that's a wonderful overlap, because before I'd studied him, I didn't have really that much of a sense of Japanese art. So this is a wonderful coming full circle for me, and reminds me of my graduate studies so long ago.
But it never leaves you, does it? I mean, I'm one of those people that I love to read. I love to learn. My books, I mean, you can't see them and it's for the best, but they're everywhere. There are piles of them all around. We're out of bookshelves at home. There are just piles of books now waiting for homes. But they're, everything that we learn, whether it's 10 years ago or tomorrow, these things stay with us. And I'll often refer back. I'll remember something that I want to refer back to, and I'll go out and dig out a book. I read a lot about, not just about Japan, but also sort of nature writing and nature writers from the last 100 years or more. And I find there's so much there. There's so much kind of great fodder and ideas and a beautiful turn of phrase. I love particularly the sort of, if you look about the sort of 1860, 1880, the turn of phrase is so incredibly beautiful and lyrical. And people write about nature in such a celebratory way and with such love and with such reverence. And I think we could all use a little bit more of that.
Had you heard of John Ruskin?
Yes, of course. And wasn't he involved with the Pre-Raphaelite movement?
Yes, and that's what drew me to him. He was friends of theirs and supported their work.
I was a huge fan of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Oh my goodness. I just love reading about their lives and their community and their ethos. You know, when you think about the painters, and then there was William Morris, the designer, and how his mission, ethos, ideology was to kind of take a step back from the industrialization that
Yes.
he saw taking place in also items and decorative items. He sort of led a movement back to things being handmade, things being made slowly. So the slow
Yeah.
home. And this was in the 1890s, I
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
so, come to think of it, while I'm talking here, it has kind of a lot of overlap to things we talk about right
It
now.
does. I don't know if you know this, but William Morris was hugely influential to the kind of Japanese equivalent of our British arts and crafts movement, which is called Minge, which is kind of the folk craft and the sort of art of the people. Soetsu Yanagi, who was one of the pivotal kind of forefathers of that movement, was hugely inspired by William Morris's ethos. It had a massive impact on his entire way of thinking about art and craft. And Minge is fascinating. It's something I actually read about in the book because it's really about the unsung heroes of craft. It's not about signing your work. It's not about glory. It's about creating something beautiful that people will use every day, a beautiful functional item. That perfect balance, that perfect marriage of form and function, stripping away excess and really cherishing the beauty of the everyday. So Minge they have to be practical items like bowls, like plates. It can't be something that is superfluous. It has to be functional to be Minge. It's really like 1920s.
Okay, so it was a little later than the arts and crafts movement in the UK.
Yeah. He was looking back. Yanagi was looking back at William Morris as kind of influential figure that it kind of inspired him. And then I believe the Minge Museum, the first Minge Museum was established in the mid-30s in Japan. And it's actually seeing a huge resurgence, which of course ties in with everything that you're interested in and your listeners are interested in. Slow, intentional, seasonal living. You know, Minge is really this is all interwoven with what they believed and their kind of new aesthetic of kind of everyday beauty and, you know, practical items.
I see William Morris designs popping up. I've seen them in ties.
You can find them in everything.
All the brands are doing William Morris.
Yeah, because it's iconic.
It might be like a recent, I'm interested in like specifically why. It might be like a recent licensing thing or something with like the timing. I don't know. But yeah, I'm with you, Mom. I'm seeing it everywhere too.
I mean, it's always been, in the UK, obviously, it's one of those things that everyone recognizes it. There are certain designs that are so kind of ingrained in our society that everybody just knows, well, that's William Morris. But yeah, if it's popping up a lot in the States, maybe it is more recent.
Okay, going back to the book and what you talk about in the book, which is everything we've been talking about. You mentioned these concepts of kisetsukan. Can you tell us a little bit about these different concepts of kisetsukan?
Okay, sure. So kisetsukan has kind of become my guiding principle. The funny thing is that I didn't actually know the right word that encompassed it until a couple of years ago. It kind of gave a name to this kind of mindful practice that I've been engaging with for many years. Kisetsukan comes from the word kisetsu or season, and it essentially means an awareness. It's something that so many Japanese people have, but don't even necessarily realize. It's especially fine-tuned in people who live in Kyoto and who practice things like tea ceremony, where seasonality is one of the kind of key pillars of the way of tea. So people who practice tea ceremony, people who practice ikebana, Japanese flower arranging, people who wear kimono daily, like geisha or maiko, these people have a particularly finely tuned, let's say, sense of the season. Whereas for most people, we have to dial that up. We have to learn how to cultivate that practice. And that takes time. But one of the things that I really encourage people to do in the book is say, look, I would love this to be a kind of companion to you on your journey. I invite you to kind of take this book on your journey while you're learning more about the seasons, more about seasonality, take inspiration from how they interact with the seasons in Japan, and then take this book on your own journey. essentially, to kind of cultivate that. Because obviously I don't live in Japan. I live in London. I live in the UK. But there are lots of things that I do in my daily life and throughout the year inspired by Japanese rituals and concepts and traditions that I've sort of learned about over the last 10 years. So I think it's something that anybody can practice anywhere. And you don't have to be in Japan to do it. You don't have to live in the countryside to do it. I am yearning to move back to the countryside where I grew up, and eventually I will make it there. But in the meantime, there are a myriad ways that I interact with nature while still living in a huge city.
Oh, yes. It's one of our favorite topics. It's so integrated with the idea of slow living. And of course, seasonal living is exactly what we're talking about. And we talk about that a lot as well. Slow living through the seasons. We have a little monthly podcast and sort of expand that, widen that and to include folklore, food, where we are in the growing season or the non-growing season or whatever, in our part of the world. So this overlap is very fascinating to me. And I know that, the Western world, part of the reason we're doing this and part of the reason that I feel personally inspired to do this is because I also grew up close to nature and realized as I became an adult and had children how our lives and our rituals had become very, very separated from the seasons. And I remember it occurring to me at some point that for my children, the main indicator of the change of seasons was the merchandise that was appearing in the stores. Like you walk in the store, in spring and you start seeing all the Easter stuff and so forth. Or in the summer, it starts all being like all about picnics and all that sort of thing. So, on some level, I became inspired to sort of do something about this, or at least do my part in at least influencing my own children about the seasons. But it sounds almost absurd, even frame it that way, because the seasons are the seasons. I mean, how are we so disconnected from it, and how we can be, led back through traditions that make it a part of their art, literature, all of that. All this is what you've done and brought this from another culture to us. So it's beautiful. So you talk about 12 key concepts. Would you like to get into that a little more?
Sure. Yeah, of course. There's so much to cover, so we won't probably get to all of them, but I can pick out a few. So shun is one I think you're going to really relate to and really connect with. Shun is essentially what's in season. What is at the peak of freshness? What is going to taste the best, have the highest nutritional content? What should we be eating now? What typifies the season? So, for example, now, if I was in Japan, it's April, I would be eating takanoko, which is bamboo shoots. So around this time of the year, the tender little bamboo shoots are beginning to emerge, and they are one of the sansai, the wild mountain vegetables, which people forage for at this time of the year. And they are considered to be the shun of the season. They're probably one of people's most favorite ingredients, and they're kind of an archetypal spring element that you'll see on menus in restaurants at this time of the year. I remember having a wonderful experience. I've eaten them many times and I've learned how to cook with them. And I actually had a wonderful class where we made an entire meal where takanoko was the basis for every dish. So we made about half a dozen dishes, and they were all based on bamboo shoots cooked in different ways. They were all delicious, obviously, but very interesting. I can only kind of liken it to the way people feel in Europe about asparagus season, particularly white asparagus in Europe, or like British asparagus season. It's kind of in spring, I would say asparagus is the shun for us. People look forward to it every year. It starts to appear on menus in restaurants, and chefs and foodies are experimenting, just enjoying the beauty of that seasonal crop, which is what shun is. And yeah, so takanoko is really kind of what you would be enjoying now if you're in Japan, amongst other sansai. I visited a particular temple that I wanted to go to for a long time, and there's a bamboo grove, huge bamboo groves alongside the temple. And as I was leaving, one of the monks came by with a wheelbarrow full of freshly harvested bamboo shoots, full of them. I'd never seen them up close that fresh. He literally must have just dug them up whilst I'd been wandering around the temple. And then he brought them to the front and put them out. And literally within 10 minutes, all these Japanese women appeared, swarmed, and then disappeared with their takanoko, and they were gone. Because fresh takanoko is something to be very excited about. And people were overjoyed that the temple had just put them out for people to take home and enjoy. They require quite a lot of preparation because you have to strip back the hard outside layers, cut them down. You have to soak them to remove the bitterness. And then there's usually, there's so many different things you can do with them. You can simmer them. You can make like a bamboo shoot sashimi. You can do all kinds of things with them. You can add them to takanoko gohan is a really common dish that you might encounter if you're in Japan in the spring, which is beautiful rice studded with little pieces of fresh bamboo shoots. Yeah, so that's just one example of how shun works. And obviously there's a different thing for every month.
Oh, I want to ask you, has the Western culture infiltrated Japan to the extent that this is not so widespread anymore? Or is this just something you see in every household? Is this still really, really a part of the everyday life in Japan?
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer. And I don't want to paint, it's a very broad brush to paint the whole nation. I would say that places where people are very interested in food, people who are sort of foodies are always, chefs and home cooks and people like myself are always going to be very excited to see things like takanoko available or on the menu. Would you see it in every household? No. But I do think, especially in the countryside, these things are still very important. They're still very deeply ingrained. And you will also come across these things, people eating these things at home. So the lady who taught me how to cook bamboo shoots in 6 different ways, as a woman who teaches cookery classes in Kyoto, there are a lot of people who are still working this way, still cooking this way, particularly in Kyoto, where they're really sort of guardians of traditional Japanese culture. That remains something that's really important to them. So yeah, definitely in Kyoto, you would see this a lot. And then anywhere out in the countryside, definitely you'll come across this. And if you're lucky, you'll spot the bamboo shoots actually coming out of the ground.
So you said they grow wild in the mountains.
They grow wild anywhere bamboo grows, which in Japan is all sorts of places. So not just in the mountains, but also, in temples, in gardens, in parks, all sorts of places, obviously wild as well, fruitfully. But yeah, you'll see them all over the country and all over the countryside.
Do people have personal gardens where they're growing their bamboo?
I'm not aware of any personal gardens where they grow bamboo because bamboo is a very invasive species.
Yes.
Yeah, there are 2 kinds. So there's a clumping variety, which people grow in pots in their gardens. Or it's like wall screening and things like that. But then there's the running variety, the climbing. Yeah, they're very invasive. So that's the kind that you'll see growing wild and outside all the temples and shrines and things like that.
Oh, wow. So that is a readily available and renewable.
Oh, yeah. And it's so much more than a food. I mean, bamboo is the fastest growing grass in the world. There are hundreds of varieties. It's been indigenous to Japan for a very, very, very long time. But it also is incredibly sustainable as a building material. It's used not just as a food source, but also in design, in architecture, in craft. Bamboo is an essential element in the tea ceremony. Tea whisks are made from bamboo traditionally. Tea scoops, chashaku, are made from bamboo. It's an essential element in Japanese life.
So let's discuss another one of the 12 key concepts.
Yeah, with pleasure. So we were talking before about textiles and about color. One of the key terms that I explore is called kasane, which is it's a language of color layering to reference or subtly nod to the seasons. So this is something that was very prominent in the Heian period, which is sort of classical Japanese period, when women would wear these exquisite, very fine, exquisite silk kimonos, which are all dyed with natural materials like roots, bark, etc. They were they were almost gossamer fine. So they would layer them over each other to create kind of color combinations that represented the seasons. So they would be referencing like a willow tree in spring or a plum blossom in late winter. And so each of these color combinations are usually 3 colors, and each color combination had a beautiful poetic name. So it was essentially part of your kind of aesthetic skill, shall we say, to be able to create these color combinations and then to wear them at the right time. because kimono is, or Japanese culture prizes anticipation. So, for example, I wouldn't wear a cherry blossom kimono to go and see the cherry blossoms to practice hanami, which is another one of the terms we'll come to in a second. So I wouldn't go cherry blossom viewing wearing a cherry blossom kimono because, firstly, I don't want to compete with the flowers. That's the first reason. I'm there to celebrate and enjoy the flowers. So I don't want to be competing with them. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I would wear that kimono maybe a week or two earlier before the flowers have bloomed in anticipation of seeing them bloom. That's when I would wear it.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, it's about building up anticipation. It's not just about the Japanese culture doesn't just prize the moment the flower blooms or the moment the moon comes out. It's the anticipation of the bloom or when the moon is slightly obscured by clouds and then it comes out and then it goes away again. Those are the moments that are considered to be of exceptional beauty.
That's so lovely. Is there anything similar, do you know, for the other side of it, for the when the moon goes away or when the cherry blossoms die?
Yeah, so there's an incredibly poetic concept in Japanese culture. It's kind of an idiom which deals with impermanence, a kind of poetic, slightly sorrowful, but also acceptance and appreciation of impermanence when the cherry blossoms shed their petals and they begin to fall, when the leaves turn and fall to the ground in the autumn. And this is called mono no oware. So this is, this kind of an exquisite feeling where you are both acknowledging the fragility and the ephemerality of all life and the fact that cherry blossoms bloom for less than 2 weeks. They are a kind of perfect metaphor for human existence because, they bloom, they're so exceptionally beautiful, they're so delicate, they're so lovely, and then they're gone. And, the slightest gust of wind or a harsh rain can wash them away. But the fact that they are so delicate, so transient, is what makes them so precious and so exceptional. And that's why they're often likened, our lives and their lives are often likened to each other. They are the perfect metaphor for the fragility of our existence.
That's so lovely. Looking over all the topics and the concepts in the book there's just so many things. It's just so rich in imagery, sensuality, the folklore, the goddesses, the spirits, all these things. I thought maybe you could speak a little bit to the supernatural elements and all this. We've been talking so much about nature, but there's that aspect of it as well. It seems to be very integrated in with all of
Oh
this.
gosh, yes, with absolute pleasure. So I'm so excited to talk about this. I'm a huge lover of folklore. I have been ever since I was a child. So I was one of those kids that was like, have Indigenous American folklore, Russian folklore, Chinese folklore, Japanese folklore, you name it. If it had folklore in the title, I wanted to read that book. So it's something I've always found fascinating and enchanting, and Japanese folklore is no exception. And there are so many stunning and interesting kind of characters. Nature is often, obviously, so I should explain that the Japanese indigenous faith is called Shinto, and it's an animistic religion. Nature is often anthropomorphized in Japanese folk tales, and so plants, flowers, and seasons are represented as human beings and given human form and human characteristics to go on their various adventures. There are 4 goddesses which represent each of the major seasons, and they dwell in the north, south, east, and west of Japan in mythological mountains, rivers, etc. One of my personal favorites is the autumnal goddess, who is a famous weaver and dyer, and she literally dyes the landscape every autumn. She gets out her paint box and she literally dyes the leaves red. When you see imagery of her, she's wearing a crimson kimono, and that's how you know it's her. And her name is Tatsuta Hime. Hime means princess, so she's the autumn princess. She dwells in an area in Japan which is famous for its autumn leaves, and that's why she has that name. So the imagery of the Tatsuta River is an established representation or symbol for autumn. So the leaves floating down, the sort of leaves make a kind of tapestry on the surface of the river as they float down it. And so as soon as you see that reference in anything, it might be in a menu, it might be on a kimono, it might be in a poem, the reference to autumn is so strongly ingrained that Japanese people immediately know that's what you're referencing, and you're talking about autumn. Autumn is the setting, or autumn is the theme that you're trying to suggest.
It sounds like, from what you said so far about the seasons, that it's very similar to a North American temperate climate. Is that true? I've never been to Japan. So is it comparable that, yeah, the leaves change in the autumn and the blossoms in the spring and all
I
of
would
this?
say yes and no. So Japan is quite a temperate climate in the sort of mainland Japan, but there are also extremes. So the northernmost isles, Hokkaido is a snow country, and then down south you have the Okinawa, kind of Okinawa archipelago, which is tropical. So mainland Japan, I would say yes. However, Japan also has to deal with great extremes and is subject to nature's winds in terms of the fact that they have a rainy season. They also have a season for storms, and they also deal with things like earthquakes and tsunamis. So whilst we have very temperate weather in the UK, we have the blossoms and we have the autumn leaves, and we don't have to deal with any of those kind of extremes of nature.
I see. And you hear so much these days about forest bathing. And I went to a program on forest bathing and was interested to learn that it originated in Japan, which ties very much into everything you're telling us about their sensitivity to nature and the seasons. So, what might you say about forest bathing? And talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Right. So forest bathing is a wonderful concept, which it is in the book. The reason I put it in the book is because it's something that anyone can do anywhere that you have access to trees. You don't need to be in Japan. You don't even need to be in a forest. You just need to develop a relationship with, your local landscape and, parks, whether that's a park or a botanical garden. Maybe you're lucky enough to have your own garden and you have some beautiful trees there. That's something that anybody really can enjoy. And it's really just about spending some quiet, thoughtful, meditative time amongst trees specifically, because of the huge benefits that we now understand that are backed up by science. When we spend time amongst trees, there are so many benefits. It reduces stress. It induces a feeling of calm, which we could all use a little more of in our very fast-paced, hectic lives. It's also to do with the essence of the trees, sort of the oils that they excrete and the things that we're breathing in, and the impact that that has on our bodies. The very real impact of surrounding yourself by immersing yourself in the deep green of a glade or a forest or a woodland, and anywhere that you can find trees, you can do that. I'm very lucky. I live quite near. I can get easily to Hampstead Heath, which is one of the most famous forests probably in London, and also we have Richmond Deer Park as well, which is the other side of London. And I've spent time in a lot of Britain's ancient forests, like the New Forest is exceptionally beautiful. And I've also obviously spent time in forests in Japan. And it's amazing. You can literally feel, or for me anyway, I can feel the sort of levels of cortisol in my body lowering as I'm walking. You can literally feel your stress levels going down. I feel my body relaxing. I feel my mind clearing. Last autumn, I think we were in the New Forest, and it was so exquisitely beautiful. And as I'm walking through the trees with my partner, little snippets would come to me, because you're in a kind of, I don't know, for me, it really helps me get into a kind of flow state where kind of words or little snippets, phrases will kind of come to me just seemingly out of nowhere, because I'm, I guess, sort of tuned in to my surroundings and I'm really present and my mind is really quiet, which I think is something that is so difficult to achieve these days, because obviously technology is constantly stealing our attention all the time. We're constantly getting emails, calls, messages. It's very difficult to be rooted where you are. And I think forest bathing is really a great way to do that, and also to connect with your local neighborhood, your local trees, your local landscape, and kind of develop a relationship with them.
Yes, I know people who have gone to Japan for training in this.
Yeah, you can get a qualification in it now. Yeah.
To your point, as you've been discussing, you don't have to go to Japan and learn how to do it. You can simply walk outside, having the intention of connecting with your surrounding nature, I think accomplishes much the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Please do try it in Japan. It's incredible. But You don't have to.
When I learned that, I was like, oh, I want to go there and walk those forests. It just certainly seems to have a real allure.
There's one place in particular, which I think you'd love, which is on an island called Yakushima, which is a UNESCO heritage site. Some of the trees there are over 1,000 years old. It's the stuff of folktales. It's the stuff of dreams. It's inspired movies. It's inspired so many artists and craftspeople and creative people from all over who make pilgrimages to go there. I actually I was meant to go in 2016, but unfortunately an earthquake prevented me from getting there. I was traveling down south to make my way there, but unfortunately I got stuck. I had to turn around and go back north. I couldn't go. So it's still on my epic wish list.
And what is the name of that place?
Yakushima.
I would love to chat a bit before we wrap up about the Japanese tradition of, well, I know the most famous that comes to mind is the Marie Kondo method of living minimally. And then there's also, you mentioned Matenai, which is like the concept of zero waste living.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I guess this idea of minimalist and zero waste living that just seems so part of the culture. It's just ingrained in the culture. I've never been to Japan, but from what I can tell, it's to such a higher degree that my friends that have visited recently, oh, it's so clean. There's hardly any trash anywhere. Also, there's hardly any trash cans anywhere, which is just crazy.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about that, about the zero waste and the sort of minimalism and how those work together.
Okay, so the rubbish bins or the trash cans. People have a very high level of civic responsibility in Japan. They take great care and great pride in their surroundings, not just their homes, but or their streets, but their whole country. So people don't litter. You won't see that. And people take their rubbish home with them. They have a very complex recycling system, can be as many as 7 different things to break it down into, depending on which prefecture you're living in. And yeah, people take it very seriously. So yeah, litter bugs, not really a thing in Japan. So yeah, so people take it very seriously. In terms of zero waste living, Japan is doing all kinds of interesting things on that level. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a dichotomy here. So I don't want to make out that Japan is kind of the promised land and they're doing everything right. They do consume a huge amount of plastic. There's a lot of plastic. There's a lot of plastic wrapping on things that's not always necessary. When I talk to people who are going to Japan for the first time, I always give them a few sustainable tips. And one of them is take your own shopping bag. So you can say in the shops when they ask you, you can say, no, thank you, I don't need one. Take your own refillable water bottle, because there is an app called My Mizu. Mizu is water, where you can find out where you can refill it. Japanese water is safe to drink. It's incredibly clean. So you can just fill your water bottle up from the tap. The other thing is chopsticks, to take your own reusable chopsticks, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of being disposable single-use ones being used every day, all the time. So to avoid that, which of course is linked to deforestation, to avoid that, you can take your own. There is a town in Japan actually that is working towards being completely zero waste, but now I have to check when. They have not reached their goal yet, but they are doing incredible things as a community. So there's a hotel, there's a restaurant, there's a recycling plant. They have a swap shop where people can donate things, and then other people in the local community can just come and take them away. Artisans and craftspeople visit them and work with items to kind of rework them, recycle them, recreate new things. I think that there is this ethos of not being wasteful and trying to use the last bit of everything and getting the most out of things, whether that's food or textiles. So using a glut of vegetables and pickling them, for example, which is done globally. All different cultures have a kind of pickling tradition. Tsukamono, or pickles, in Japan is something you'll often see done as part of a kind of zero waste effort by restaurants. And there are lots of people who are trying to educate people about recycling less, using less plastic, things like that, because there are natural alternatives, and Japan has a long history of natural wrapping methods for food, particularly, and sweets. So things like wrapping in bamboo leaves is traditional, oak leaves, cherry blossom leaves in the spring for spring sweets. So there are lots of alternatives that people are trying to kind of remind people about. And then there's also things like, are you familiar with Japanese wrapping traditions like furoshiki?
Yes, I've heard of that.
So furoshiki are squares of cloth, usually made of cotton or the fancy version of silk, but generally you'll encounter them in cotton. And they are printed with beautiful, colorful seasonal designs. And you can use them to wrap gifts instead of paper. So traditionally, when you receive a beautiful gift in Japan, it might be wrapped in a furoshiki. And they're not just great for wrapping presents. So a lot of people are encouraging people to wrap them in fabric instead of in paper, which can't be recycled. Because obviously gift wrap has metallic accents and things like that can't be recycled. Furoshiki also were used to transport your clothes on the way to and from the sento or the onsen, so the bathhouse or the hot springs. People use them to wrap things they're going to put in storage. There's a million different ways of using them. You can also make them into fabric bags to take to the farmer's market, or if you're going to go out foraging and you need to quickly, you weren't planning to forage, but you've seen something, as we all have, grab your furoshiki, turn it into a bag quickly, put your produce in there and take it home. There's a million ways to use them. And they also obviously reference the seasons as well. So they're a lovely way to kind of engage with both with seasonal ideas, but also kind of more sustainable concepts as well. And they're an ingrained part of Japanese culture. It's just one example.
So it doesn't require sewing.
No. Thank God, because otherwise I would be eliminated immediately.
It's just all folding. So when you said, you see something, you can quickly make a bag.
That's really it. And once you've learned a kind of techniques, it's very easy. You can wrap anything from a bottle to a book, create a bag quickly. Yeah, they're incredibly versatile, and they're affordable, they're beautiful. They're often made and designed by Japanese artisans. So you're engaging with Japanese culture on several levels in a very accessible way.
I have two questions. One, I'm going to stump you again with, do you have the name of that town that you said with the goal of being zero waste?
I do. Kamikatsu, Kamikatsu. So that's their planning. Their plan is to be Japan's first zero waste town. That is their ultimate goal.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then my other question is, why do you think there's this intrinsic attitude of just more civil duty than here?
Well, my personal belief that's to do with two things. It's essentially to do with the foundations of Japanese culture and Japanese religion. I believe it's connected to both Shinto and Buddhism, and also Confucianism. And that's where I think that this idea comes from: having respect for nature, having respect for others, your locale, the people in your community, your elders, the landscape and the land that you live on, and all the gifts that you receive from nature. Yeah, that all goes back to these kind of core belief systems.
So it's sort of a foundational religious, spiritual belief that infiltrates into the culture.
That's what I believe. Yeah.
Yes. And you mentioned earlier that Shinto, I believe, is the indigenous tradition in Japan.
Yes, that's right.
Often we're reminded in the Western world to look back to the indigenous wisdom to sort of reclaim our connection with the natural world. A very interesting parallel.
That's absolutely right. It's Japan's most ancient indigenous religion, and it has a huge impact on many aspects of Japanese life. And I think there's a lot that we could learn from Shinto concepts.
Do you think that this interest in minimalism comes out of that same sort of attitude of respect for your environment? It sort of all fits together.
I would say it's all kind of interwoven. I think that minimalism it comes more from a Buddhist root, this idea of stripping away excess and opulence and just using just enough, this concept of just enough, not too much, not too little, just enough. That's a very Buddhist idea.
It's so interesting because it's so not capitalist. And yet
No,
Japan is,
it's
of
not,
course,
Susie.
like most countries, a capitalist country. So I'm just interested.
And I think that's like I was saying, because I don't want to imply that Japan is like a promised land. It's not. Of course, it's a modern civilization with all the pros and cons that come with that. But these fountainheads of Japanese culture, these foundational ideas, have lasted the test of time and resulted in these interesting concepts and cultural traditions.
And maybe I'm just sort of like thinking in real time here, but maybe why it just feels so different in the West, and especially in America being such a young country, is that in a way, since we don't have, while we were founded on the basis of like certain religions, we don't have this strong ancient tie to a religious sort of, I don't know. So in a way, our religion is consumerism. It is capitalism. And maybe that's why it feels so different.
Yeah. I don't think the indigeneity in North America as it was being settled was embraced. Put it that way. In these more ancient cultures, is a thread that has found its way.
Yeah, you severed ties, whereas Japan has guarded its culture against modernization. Some people almost say that Japan sort of colonized itself and modernized itself during the Meiji Restoration to prevent being colonized from an outside nation in order to protect itself and to protect its own culture. They've done a really good job of that because you can still experience things that have been practiced in Japan for 1,000 years. Practices like hanami, cherry blossom viewing, which we enjoy every spring, stretch so far back into the past, and we can connect with that by taking part in these rituals. I don't feel that you need to be in Japan to do that. I mean, the US famously has incredible cherry blossoms in DC, which actually were a gift from Japan, but not just in DC, in many beautiful flowering trees in the States that are not cherries, like we do in the UK. We have gorgeous apple blossoms, for example. We can celebrate the arrival of spring, and we can mark that moment in seasonal time by engaging in hanami every spring. I do, whether I'm in Japan or not. And I have, there are a few local trees walking distance from where I live that I like to go and visit each year and check in on and see how they're doing as part of my kind of spring rituals. And I just, sometimes I just go by myself. Sometimes I might take a close friend. Sometimes I take a book, or sometimes I like to take my tea things and make tea there as a kind of kind of offering, I suppose. Yeah, it's something that you can enjoy. Everybody has a favorite tree, right? You can enjoy that every spring, wherever you are.
So it sounds like you have studied Japan, which obviously has many aspects which tie into the idea of slow living. How does slow living show up in your life? I know you live in London, you live in the city. How would you say you tie all these things you've learned about your interest in Japan and in your own personal inclinations for slow living in your life?
I think there are lots of ways it shows up in my life. And I think because I can't yet escape to the country, which I long to do, I have to find other ways. Foraging is something that I've done since I was a child. If you grow up in the countryside in England and you've picked a blackberry, then, you learn to forage from a young age. So foraging is something I enjoy and I continue to do whenever I can. Like we talked about before, buying vintage, buying secondhand. We don't have thrift stores, as you would say. We have charity shops and we have flea markets and car boot sales. So I'm a regular visitor at all of those, and I have been for a very long time. So, in my home, you will find a lot of secondhand furniture, book, textiles, pretty much everything you can imagine, really. I believe that those pieces have more soul. And I also, I believe in paying people fairly for their craft and for their time. So what else? I'm trying to think. So things like eating seasonally, obviously. I grow a lot of edible plants and flowers to make all kinds of, seasonal dishes, whether that's kind of Japanese fusion or kind of British classic. I grow things to make tisanes. I'm very interested in tea and tea culture. I have a very small garden. When I lived in the countryside, I grew a lot of veg. Right now, I don't have the space, but I long to do it again. But I'm working with what I have. I also practice sado or chado, which is the way of tea. I've been studying that formally for a couple of years now, informally for many years before that. It's a very mindful practice, which I think embodies a lot of slow living concepts. So yeah, there's lots of ways that I'm sort of engaging on a daily basis or trying to engage on a daily basis.
Are you a full-time writer now?
Yeah, I am. That's right.
Oh, wonderful. So when you said you took your tea things to admire the cherry blossoms, I knew that you had a slow living aspect to your personal life for sure.
Yeah. I think, I feel like a bit of a fraud because I'm living in a city, but I mean, globally, most of us are more than ever before.
Yes, we say it all the time. We have to learn how to integrate these ideas into wherever you are. We can't all move out to
And
the
you
country.
can
It just,
live out in the country and not have a very slow, you not be
Absolutely.
present
Oh,
there either.
sure.
So it's
Yeah.
less about that and more about the mindfulness and the presence, as you mentioned. So what does the good dirt mean to you?
Oh, yeah. So we are nourished by nature, both literally, metaphorically, and creatively. When I think about all the gifts that we are so incredibly privileged to receive from the natural world. And then as those, wither, as the cherries shed, as the leaves fall, they literally become the fodder for our next creative endeavor and for the next stage of life. So, I mean, it fuels everything. That's what I thought of when you asked me that phrase.
Absolutely.
This was so wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have learned so much, Natalie. I've learned so much from this interview, and I really, really look forward to perusing your book and going through it. It just sounds absolutely delightful. I have not seen it yet. Tell us when it comes
Of
out.
course. And Mary, I hope you're going to love it. It comes out on May 14th. So it's less than a month to go now.
Oh, wonderful.
It's very exciting and nerve-wracking.
When this episode comes out, it will be available. So for those listening, you don't have to wait at all.
Fantastic.
So tell us about where our listeners can find you, where they can find the book, and how they can engage with your work.
Oh, that would be my pleasure. So you can find me over on Instagram. That's usually where I hang out. And I'm sharing kind of flower-infused thoughts and kind of Japanese seasonal living concepts and ideas and seasonal recipes, poetry, folklore, all of that good stuff. So you can find me over on Instagram, Natalie Leon. And I'm also going to be starting a Substack as well. I've just found you guys. I'm very excited to join your community. I'm a little bit late to the party. I'm a little bit nervous. That's why I'm a little bit late. But I'm really looking forward to kind of being able to share longer posts more and get like kind of more thoughtful, long form pieces, all the things that I'm interested in, folklore, flowers, festivals, etc. over on Substack. And my Substack is called The 72 Seasons of My Life, which references the 72 Japanese micro seasons, which is another great passion of mine and feeds into all of my kind of interests about seasonality.
Oh, amazing.
72 micro seasons. Okay, that's going to be our next interview, I think. We'll have to have you back. I want to hear about all that. We will be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at WeAreLadyFarmer. That's WeAreLadyFarmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.